Now we will shift focus a bit and talk about the logistics of submitting materials to NACJD. We refer to the process of submitting data as depositing. We've created guidelines for depositing quantitative, qualitative, and geospatial data, and they are available on our website. They were designed in response to the submissions that we typically receive to address issues that we see on a semi-regular basis. During our initial review, we used these criteria presented in these guidelines to assess incoming submissions. So what to deposit? Here's a checklist of the list of items that you should plan to deposit where applicable in fulfillment of your archiving requirements. The very first item is the new criteria, the new requirement, the data submission checklist and user guide. I'm going to actually click on this and open it up. This is a PDF form that's available on our website, and as I said, it's very new, and I'm not going to spend the time to go over this in a great amount of detail, but I wanted you to be able to see this so that you could know what to expect when you got to the point of being ready to submit. So at the top, we capture information on the project title, your name, your grant number, grant manager name, and email. Then the remainder of this page details the information that is available to help you, some helpful resources, and then the remainder of this document goes into the actual checklist component. So when you are preparing your documentation, you'll want to make sure that each of these elements is provided in your submission. Similarly with the data, you'll want to make sure that you adhere to these criteria and make sure that you read about the direct identifiers and the indirect identifiers and how they should be treated. And then throughout the remainder of the document, it talks about the different types of data that can be submitted and links you to the deposit guidelines that I mentioned a moment ago. And then other project documents that we require that we've mentioned previously, and I will cover this when I go back to the slide. And then the secondary data analyst guide. This is a new, this in addition to the checklist, is a new requirement in that we are now requesting that you provide information that will help guide secondary data users so that they can know things up front that would help them. So for example, information about weighted variables and how to make decisions for when to select one weight variable over another. Things like that can be covered and should be covered in the user guide. And then finally, the data archiving file inventory. So you will want to be sure to include an inventory of every file being submitted with a brief description of the file name, and for quantitative data, in addition to the number of variables and case counts, just give us a picture of what you're actually submitting. And the remaining pages actually provide a space for you to be able to do that. In addition, let me go back a slide. In addition to the data submission and user guide, you will need to supply a copy of the original IRB approval, informed consent, and privacy certificate, as was mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. Also, the de-identified data, the documentation for the data, including code books, survey instruments, reports, things of that nature, syntax or special coding that was used to conduct the analyses, and bibliographies for any publications, whether they are journal articles, book chapters, conference presentations, anything that ties directly to your project. We want that information because I'll describe this in more detail later, but we will post that on our website so that people can know what has already been done and either continue exploring those topics or maybe take a different angle on what you've already attempted to do. So all of these items are needed in order to conduct our initial review. And if they are lacking from the deposit submission in any way, we will contact you by way of your grant manager and ask you to provide them and work through the issues. Of course, you want to make sure that you submit final cleaned data regardless of the data format, so quantitative, qualitative, or geospatial. You'll need to submit the data that was used to produce the analysis and or tables that appear in any report or published findings, including journal articles and things of that nature. You'll want to include any transformed, computed, or recoded variables constructed or derived from the variables collected using the data collection instruments. You'll want to provide all transformation, computer, recode, syntax along with the data files. And then for quantitative data files in particular, if you have character or string variables in your data set that were not used for analysis, you need to remove those before submission. It takes us a considerable amount of time to carefully review character variables for potentially identifying information, so you'll need to remove those types of fields, like comments and note fields, before submission. When submitting data documentation for archiving, be sure to include unused copies of instruments and scales with question ticks where applicable, a code book for each data set, the secondary data analyst user's guide that I described a moment ago and showed you in the checklist. And this information will be used to populate the study homepage and also will be provided as a standalone user guide document available for download on our website when the study is released. You'll also want to include an interviewer guide or coding instrument if those are applicable for your project. And I just wanted to note the very last point is that our desired formats for documentation are PDF, Microsoft Word, rich and or plain text, but we do accept other formats as well. And if you had something that falls outside of those, just shoot us an email or call us and we can talk about what we would need. As it relates to technical documentation, here are some of the items that can be present in technical documentation. So at the project level, interviewing schedule or procedures, including the flow of interviews and their time, the time periods for follow-up. Core questions that appear over several waves. This can be somewhat of a crosswalk linking between waves in tables or lists. This can be very useful from a secondary data analyst perspective. Also, descriptions of the strengths and limitations of the data, including research questions that can and cannot be addressed with the data. If these are known, you can pass this information on to future data users. And then also contact information, not just for NACJD processing staff. That is very important. So if we have follow-up questions, we need to know who to get in touch with to address those. But also sometimes the questions that we receive may fall beyond the scope of what we are able to provide. And if that is the case, we would work with you to identify a person that could hopefully help answer that question. And then at the file level, an inventory of the files. This is covered in the submission checklist. But an inventory that details how the files relate to one another and how they link up is very important. The data file structure should be clearly identified, especially if the data are in non-rectangular format. Some type of a coder manual to describe variable naming conventions, skip patterns, missing data designations. Information on imputation procedures that explain how missing data have been accommodated in the file and how it affects the interpretation of the data. So you'll want to provide the method and the extent of the imputation procedure. Also, information on how to aggregate the data if the data are analyzable at different levels. Instructions for merging data files when the collection has several files that can be merged using a linking variable. and also information on how to subset the data for subgroup analysis using topical components of the data. Also, errata to identify known mistakes pertaining to the data and what was done to address it. And finally, frequently asked questions are very useful for complex collections or serial collections. Here are some of the elements in a code book that we look for at the point of submission and when we are assessing your submission. On the left side are some very common elements required for most any code book. So variable names, making sure that variable names are assigned to every variable and that they adhere to your variable naming convention. Value labels for every code in the data set. Again, we're looking for a unique label that is assigned to each code for that particular variable. Missing data should be declared missing, and each value of missing data should have its own distinct code. Things like you wouldn't want to use 0 to represent both non-response and missing data. So the value of none. So if no one answered a question, if you use 0 to designate that, you would want a different code for missing values. And then for variable formats, you'll want to include the variable type, whether it's numeric or character or a date variable, and then the variable length and explicit or implicit decimal specifications in the data set. So if you had a weight variable that was to a certain precision, maybe 10 decimal places out, you'll want to make sure that that is reflected in the documentation. And then on the right side are additional elements that may or may not be included depending on the nature of your project. The exact question text is often very helpful for data analysis, secondary data analysis. Additionally, skip pattern instructions, information for weighted or unweighted univariate statistics, and frequencies for categorical variables can be very helpful. This is something that we oftentimes will use to make sure that the data that we are reading in on our end matches what your documentation, what your code book says that it should. So just a final check, a verification that everything is correct, or if not, it would be something that we would follow up with you about to resolve. Column locations if the data are being distributed as fixed-length ASCII data files. And then also, variable groupings can be very useful if the data contain many variables or if the data were clearly collected in sections or structured in different levels. Some of these elements can be provided in the technical documentation or user's guide rather than within the code book. But the important point here is just to make sure that this level of information is documented and submitted. When depositing syntax code, you want to be sure that the code for all transformed variables and the method for deriving them is included. And also be sure to include the syntax necessary to replicate tables, charts, graphs, etc. found in published findings. And for more information on this, you'll want to consult the deposit submission checklist and or the deposit guidelines that I've already mentioned. For projects that only involve analysis of existing data that is already publicly available, where the product of that project is the analysis alone, the data itself does not have to be deposited. So in those instances, researchers are encouraged to deposit the code that produced the analysis and indicate that the project is a secondary analysis of existing data on our deposit form. I'll show you the form momentarily. In these instances, you should provide specific information in your syntax file for where the data were obtained, whether it's a web page or an address if it was requested by mail, and then provide that directly in the syntax so that the reference to the exact data set name, the web page or URL where you downloaded it from is included so that anyone who is trying to obtain these files to replicate your findings or extend the findings can go and get that same information and use that as their starting point. And a list of publications should also be submitted. ICPSR has a bibliography of data-related literature, and this is a continuously updated database of thousands and thousands of citations of works using data held in the ICPSR archive. The works include journal articles, books and book chapters, government and agency reports, dissertations, conference papers, and many, many more. The bibliography facilitates literature searches by social scientists, students, journalists, policymakers, funding agencies, and a variety of other audiences. And they use it to identify much of the research that's already been undertaken in a specific area, replicate analysis of data, avoid duplicating analysis that has already been conducted, and also identify cross-disciplinary implications and uses of the data. So once the study is released, the publications that you submit at the time of depositing are linked to the project's homepage on our website. So secondary data analysts can also have that information. So once you've compiled all of the materials needed to satisfy the archiving requirement, you will need to submit them to NACJD. And most submissions can be done through our online deposit form via our website. And in instances where that's not possible, such as if you have hard copy materials or large video data files, we will work with you to identify a suitable alternative. But submitting the files is easy as initiating a new form, completing a few fields, uploading the files, and then signing the form electronically. So the next slide is going to show you how to do this on our website, and if our website cooperates a little bit later, I'm going to actually show you how to do this. So this is a snapshot of the NACJD homepage, and you see here I've got an arrow pointing to the third tab, the Deposit Data tab. So if you were to click on this tab, there'd be a button where you'd have to select that you wanted to submit data as an NIJ awardee, and then this form would appear. And what this form describes is what this form entails is you typing some basic metadata, so descriptions about your data project, the title of your project, your name and your affiliation with your institution, an abstract, what the type of data is, your grant number name, just a few, maybe a dozen or so fields. And then also a field where you should always remember to type out your grant manager's name and email address. And once you have submitted this, you will get an automated email that looks something like this within 24 hours. And this message is really akin to a receipt. So this is ICPSR's acknowledgement that you submitted files, and it provides at this where my mouse is highlighting the deposit title, gives the title that you provided in the title field. The deposit number is a unique number assigned to every submission. So if you were to today submit something and you had 34427 as your number, and you forgot something and came back and did it again, the next one would incrementally increase. So we just need a way to keep them distinct on our end. So that's what the deposit number is. And then the link to the metadata fields that you completed. So if you were to click on this, it would take you back to our web page where you could, if you needed to, edit the metadata description that you entered. So if you perhaps toggled the wrong selection and you selected geospatial data instead of quantitative data, you could go back and fix that. And then at the bottom of this inventory email is a listing of all the files that you submit, in addition to our best guess just with our automated system reading it at what it was. So it will provide the file name that you used, the date that it was scanned. We scan everything for viruses, and then the guess as to what the document is. And so in the second example in this list, you'll see that it's saying that this is an SPSS file and it has 99 variables and 826 cases. And so this is one more way, a final check for you to verify that the file that you intended to submit was actually the one you submitted. Once a submission is received, NACJD staff begin the process of inventorying the items and compiling a summary to send to NIJ grant manager. If any issues or inconsistencies are found, we will generate a list like this one and communicate them to you through your grant manager, working toward getting any issues rectified. And so once all issues are resolved, we conduct a final review and create a detailed report and include some processing, priority, and release method recommendations. And we send that to your grant manager and the Data Resource Program Manager, Patrick Clark, within 10 business days. And the grant manager and the DRP manager review it and make final decisions and assignments based on that. So this entire process, from the moment you deposit data until we receive the final decisions, can, depending on the circumstance, take a few or several weeks. But at the point when the recommendations are received from the grant manager and confirmed by the DRP manager, the data are at that point added to our processing queue and ready to be assigned to a data processor for full processing.